The Sound of Hellmouth in Shakespeare. A summary and reflection on Kurt Schreier's article, Here's a Knocking Indeed, Macbeth and the Harrowing of Hell. Sound is an important aspect to the theater. By observing sound in the play of Macbeth, Kurt Schreier in his article, Here's a Knocking Indeed, makes the argument that a great deal of what makes Shakespeare unique is expressed not just in dialogue but in sound. He does this by focusing on one particular sound, that is the knocking that occurs in Act 2 that drives Macbeth insane and provokes the porter to pretend to be a devil. This knocking is significant for it serves as a commentary and reminds the audience of the older miracle plays. In the case of the knocking, it was reminiscent of the old mystery plays that used to depict theological biblical scenes, in particular the Harrowing of Hell and the Last Judgment. In the old pageant cycles, or miracle plays, they would depict the harrowing of hell, and in this scene Christ would knock on the gates of the hell, or actually limbo, and wake the dead who were not able to enter before his death on the cross. The knocking in Macbeth very importantly shows that Shakespeare's writing was shaped by this scene. Macbeth further reminds the audience of this when he says he wishes he could wake Duncan with his knocking. The thought of resurrecting the dead with a knocking was first seen in the pageant plays prior to it being referenced by Shakespeare. The way this knocking sound was borrowed or reused could be thought of as a stage prop. When the hellmouths were knocked over in the plays, it would make a noise, and that noise in a way was synonymous with hellmouth itself. It can be borrowed and reused. In the notes for Harrowing of the Hell, Rastall, a scholar who Schreier cites, found an example of people who would use pots and pans in order to create a sound. Thus, the sound had a clear material origin. Meanwhile, in Macbeth and in the Doomsday or Last Judgment plays, they would use the same exact metallic drum sound in order to recreate the same sort of setting. This is because it was the same method being used, just in a different context. However, Shakespeare did rely on his audience's understanding of this sound. He expected them to understand where it came from. While the prop of the knocking sound most certainly was a prop, this sound was also far from being merely a prop. In the case of the knocking, the sound had a meaning beyond just resemblance of the sound used in pageant plays. Rather, it was intentionally used to remind the audience. The porter serves as perhaps the best example of this. When the knocking is heard at the gate, the porter begins to play with the audience's expectations. In the previous cycle plays, the devils would often be at the gates of hell. The porters here, in this situation, hears knocking and then drunkenly pretends to be a devil. The audience is familiar with both the sound and the representation of the devil in another context, and then they're seeing the porter here pretend to be a devil in this context. This is further illustrated when the porter actually asks the people who arrive at the gate for a tip. Pray ye remember the porter. This is also reminiscent of the old cycle plays because the devils would actually stop scenes in the cycle plays and ask the audience for money. But another example of a devil comparison is with Macbeth himself. After he kills Duncan, he becomes the prime example of somebody tormented. Devils are usually tormented when they hear the sound of Christ approaching at the gate. Christ knocks on the gate and they begin to shiver. The Savannahs would do this in those old plays. Now, instead of it being the devils who are shivering, it's Macbeth who's shivering at the sound of the knocking at the gate. So it's very easy to compare Macbeth to the devil in that situation. However, with these comparisons, it's also important to realize that Shakespeare was not writing a Renaissance miracle play. Rather, that was directly opposed to the expressed intent. The porter is not a devil, rather he is a clown pretending to be a devil, and he disowns the comparison when he says this place is too cold for hell. The line is very dismissive of the old pageant play comparison, even after invoking the comparison in the first place. Meanwhile, at the end of the knocking, we don't see Christ or any Christ-like figure, we just see two Scottish lords. The noise does not seem to apply only to those who are, and the noise isn't only bothering those who are going to hell, like it would in the old miracle plays, Rather, it bothers the virtuous people like Linux as well. However, the extra layer of meaning in Act 2 comes as a statement in the form of the knocking. Scholars have supposed that this denial of association with hell shows a weakness in Jacobean theology. The king at the time was James I, who previously was just known as James IV of Scotland, and here Shakespeare is writing a Scottish play for a Scottish king. There was, needless to mention, a great deal of pressure, and people have interpreted the play in a different way as a result. Some have insisted that it shows an agreement with King James's rule, since a great deal of rhetoric throughout the play is about the admirability of the monarch, and we see Scottish lords once the knocking ends, suggesting that they are like Christ. However, Schreyer quotes those that entertain the opposite opinion that it was part of resistance theory. Rather than praising the divine right of kings in James's honor, Macbeth as a play could also be interpreted as largely skeptical of the way a monarchy functioned. Duncan appoints his own son instead of Macbeth, even after he gives a speech on merit over blood. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are both the prime examples of what a king and queen are not supposed to be. They're the epitome of the just monarch, or the polar opposite, rather. And they kill in order to take the throne, so they're an example of a corrupt monarchy. In the end of the play, instead of the rightful King Malcolm defeating Macbeth, we see Macduff, who's technically a traitor, defeat Macbeth. The play does not make royalty appear particularly admirable. Now, that's one message to consider, is the criticism of monarchy. The other message to consider is the criticism of those who are opposed to theater. At the time, there was a tendency to compare all theater productions to older Catholic cycle plays. Because Shakespeare was writing after the English Reformation, his contemporaries felt that all theater should be banned for being too Catholic. Many of the cycle plays were actually banned as a result. The actual cycle play that Shakespeare borrows the knocking from, The Harrowing of the Hell, was prohibited since it was seen as unbiblical and appears in an apocryphal text called the Gospel of Nicodemus. By choosing to reference an outlawed form of theater, Shakespeare is making a criticism of sorts. Schreyer words this criticism as though it were a knock-knock joke. You hear the king, you hear the knocking and expect it to be Christ, after the porter reminds you of the devil, but then it turns out to only be two Scottish lords. This is a joke both on the preachers who compared Shakespeare's theater to Catholic productions, and a joke on the lords who were expecting to see themselves depicted in an admirable light. Instead, they're depicted sort of satirically. This influence of the pageant plays on Shakespeare is sometimes mistaken as the dry bones effect. In other words, for those who are more critical of the miracle plays, they tend to study them as though they were something elevated by Shakespeare, like they were nothing and then Shakespeare references them, and now this sound has meaning, and the knock-knock and the miracle plays now have a more elevated role. Schreyer rejects this tendency, contrarily to think that Shakespeare was merely creating a modern version of the same thing is also incorrect. So he's not just departing from the miracle plays, nor is he creating the same thing. Both opinions happen to be wrong. Rather, these sounds and shapes form Shakespeare's theater. Many of the people working on the productions would use the same methods they were familiar with in times past. While the iconoclasm made many divisions with previous religious-themed plays, they were remembered by the audience, and these sounds were remembered by the audience, and Shakespeare expected his audience to remember them when he wrote his work. The level of depth at which they spoke on their own merit, even without Shakespeare. So they didn't need Shakespeare to resurrect them. They were already plenty meaningful as they were. Schreyer leaves his article with two main points. First, when Shakespeare includes noises in his plays, when he did this, he was working with the expectation the audience would understand the reference. The second thing is that he was referencing these plays in a way that was not supposed to depict them as inferior to Renaissance plays. Rather, it was more the logical continuation of the same thing, because for all the brilliance that can be attributed to Shakespeare, he did not invent the Hellmouth or the stage production. He relied on them to shape his own theater. Okay, I wish I had time to show you guys a clip here, but you might want to check these out. And that's all. So you can see the knocking for yourself.